Hello! We turn now back to Hamlet. When we ended our foray into Act 1, we were exploring Hamlet's meeting with the ghost of his dead father, who has come from purgatory in battle armor to command his son to avenge his murder by slaying his killer, his younger brother Claudius, who now sits on the throne of Denmark. The ghost tells Hamlet that after dying in an orchard where he was napping, he discovered in death that he was murdered, and how and why. Now, King Hamlet's wife Gertrude was, he says, betraying him sexually with Claudius before his death, and she was therefore complicit with Claudius in planning his murder. Claudius wanted the throne, the adulterous Gertrude wanted Claudius in her bed, and this galls the dead king. Thus he says, "Now Hamlet, here 'tis given out that sleeping in my orchard a serpent stung me, but know, thou noble youth, that serpent that did sting thy father's life now wears his crown." And how did Gertrude become involved in this? So to seduce, won to his shameful lust she was, the will of my most seeming virtuous queen. Now, that word seeming, I hope, registered with you. It picks up Hamlet's use of that word seams, you remember earlier, when he punned on seams, the seams of his morning dress, seams as in a sartorial way, the seams in the cloth, tied to the appearance, the outward appearance of something. Now, Gertrude pretended to be the loving wife of King Hamlet while he was alive, while all the while, he says, she was sexually betraying him with his brother, just as even now Gertrude pretends to be mourning her dead husband when in fact it is all a seams, an outward show. Well, not surprisingly, Hamlet suspects everyone around him now all the more because they all seem to be enacting some particular show of grief that he knows is untrue. Now, King Hamlet stresses that Gertrude's sexual weakness was not ambition, as it was with Claudius. Rather, it was her lust. He says that Claudius seduced her and that she yielded to him far too easily, that it was that weakness in her that did it. So lust, though to a radiant angel linked, will sate itself in a celestial bread and prey on garbage. Now, note that ancient thought has it that when we have this kind of corruption within the royal family, this pestilential garbage rooted in Claudius's ambition and in Gertrude's lust, that the entire body politic becomes corrupted as well. Because it was that combination of ambition and lust that led to the poisoning of King Hamlet. And consider the way in which the king describes the effects of this poison that was poured into his ear. He says that this juice of the cursed Habonia in the vial, and into the porches of my ear it was poured, the leprous distilment, whose effect holds such an enmity with blood of man that swift as quicksilver the poison courses through the natural gates and alleys of the body, and most instant tatter barked about most laser-like with vile and loathsome crust on all my smooth body. The effect of the poison poured in King Hamlet's ear was corruption on his body. Blisters and sores immediately appeared as he was dying. The body, in short, became corrupted by this poison. Now, I mentioned that ancient tradition of thought, still prevalent in Shakespeare's time, that the state of the land, the state of the kingdom itself, is reflected in the physical and moral state of the king. Thus, after this poisoning and the corruption of King Hamlet's body, Denmark itself is as corrupted as that body covered with sores was, and it is also corrupted morally, as morally corrupt as Claudius, the murderer, was. Thus, Hamlet says that it is an unweeded garden, Denmark is. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely, reflecting the moral state of the killer and the physical state of the legitimate king. Now, poison then, the poison poured in the ear, breeds this corruption. And as the king Hamlet says, the serpent that stung him in his orchard now wears his crown. Now, why is it important that this poison was specifically poured into King Hamlet's ears? Well, just as outward appearances, we know, in this play are deceptive and that we cannot trust what we see, neither can we trust what we hear. Words that are lies, and certainly Claudius tells many of them, are poison as well. And as a result, when Claudius pretends in words to be mourning his brother, that is merely an extension of the poison, if you will, that was poured into his ear and that killed him. It is yet another poisoning, the poison of lies, the poison of deception. Well, the dead king charges Hamlet, his son, to avenge him. Like Claudius, he doesn't hesitate to tell Hamlet what he must do. And although, like Claudius, telling Hamlet he wishes he will not go to Wittenberg, so too the king phrases this wish that he kill his own killer as a request. The fact is that in both cases, both the command not to, both don't go to Wittenberg and kill Claudius, both of those are really commands. They are things that Hamlet feels that he cannot decline. Claudius must die to avenge the king who has suffered not just betrayal and death, but now also, because of Claudius's killing, suffers purgatorial fires, because, as the ghost explains, sins were still on his soul. He had not had time to confess. But why does King Hamlet specifically tell Hamlet not to kill Gertrude, his wife? He says, "Let her soul contrive against thy mother aught. Leave her to heaven, and to those thorns that in her bosom lodge, to prick and sting her." Does he want Hamlet not to kill Gertrude because there are still vestiges of love for his adulterous wife? Perhaps he's remembering the love they once had. Or perhaps he fears, the king does, that if he kills her, he will have to serve more time in purgatory, because although she was complicit as an accessory in the killing, she did not enact it. Or perhaps King Hamlet's desire here is to punish his wife all the more exquisitely and painfully by making her marinate in her own corrosive guilt, sort of the way in which Medea wants to keep Jason alive, suffering guilt and grief. Well, the king's final words to Hamlet are, "Remember me," as if Hamlet could forget. As we've seen, Hamlet is beset with painful memories of his father. But more specifically, when he says, "Remember me," the ghost means, remember this particular scene, this visitation, and remember my command, kill Claudius. Well, Hamlet vows that he will do so, and thus says, "Whilst his memory holds a seat in this distracted globe, I will remember thee, yea, from the table of my memory I'll wipe away all trivial records, so to keep this one more intact. And thy commandment all alone shall live within the book and volume of my brain." Now, note that pun he makes as he speaks here on the distracted globe. He's referring obliquely to the Globe Theater, where the audience is watching this play, but specifically Hamlet is referring to the globe of his own skull, his circumscribed mind. Hamlet is trapped within the globe of his own skull, a private, isolated world of churning thought that is like a hell unto itself. Now, Hamlet's soliloquies, in which he speaks to himself, are a manifestation of that private, solitary inner world of consciousness in which he is trapped. It's a world cut off from and unlike that of any other human being around him. Hamlet distrusts appearances, He knows that villains smile and try to hide their villainy. But remember that at this point, even though he distrusts appearances, Hamlet believes that the ghost is real. When he returns and speaks to Horatio and the others, he says that he believes what he has seen, and says that he will swear by the sword. He also goes so far as to suggest this belief by referring almost comically to the ghost as if it were sort of a subterranean material reality rather than just a supernatural appearance. He refers to him at one point as an old mole, as a fig fellow in the cellar. Now, he also, however, tells Horatio, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt in your philosophy. That is to say, reason, logic, human knowledge cannot know reality. It's too mysterious ever to pin down. And that's important because even though he acknowledges at this point that he believes in the reality of the ghost, already by the end of this scene, certain doubts seem to have begun to creep into his mind. And the question is then, how long can he continue to believe in the ghost's reality if he's already beginning to have some doubts? And then if he cannot believe in the ghost reality, can he act on the ghost's command? Well, we see this sense of doubts even now starting to creep in a little bit when he observes to Horatio, as perchance hereafter shall think meet me, he says, as I perchance hereafter shall think meet, that is appropriate, to put an antic disposition on. An antic disposition, what does he mean? He means he's going to pretend to be insane. Why not act immediately to kill Claudius? Why engage in this play acting of antic derangement when all along Hamlet has been complaining bitterly that feigned behaviors always hide the truth, and lamenting the fact that he sees others enacting false roles? Well, Hamlet plans to adopt the disguise of madness for specific reasons, as we find out shortly. It's a way of hiding, at least temporarily, his vengeful intentions so that Claudius will perhaps let down his guard. Hamlet hopes that by pretending to be insane, Claudius will think that he is harmless, and perhaps then he can more easily surprise Claudius, much as Orestes used a ruse to surprise Clytemnestra. But there's another reason for this plan to perform an antic disposition as well. By acting madly, and by watching the reactions to his madness of Claudius and Gertrude and others, he can gain information about their guilt through those reactions to him. But the fact is that if, even at this point, shortly after seeing the ghost, Hamlet wants and needs to gather information to confirm what the ghost told him, that it implies that he isn't 100% certain, even now, that the ghost was his father, no matter what he said. Just moments after their encounter, Hamlet already wants to corroborate Claudius's guilt before striking at him. Now, one reason Hamlet holds back this way is that, as we've seen, he distrusts all earthly appearances, let alone supernatural appearances. And another reason is that, bear in mind, Hamlet is not burning with zeal to shed blood the way Clytemnestra, the way Orestes was burning to kill Clytemnestra, and Clytemnestra was burning to kill Agamemnon. Rather, Hamlet regards this charge to avenge his father's death not as something to be desired, but rather as a moral burden, as a painful obligation. Even though he despises Claudius, nonetheless, he suffers under this command. He says, I pray, the time is out of joint. O cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right. Time is out of joint. It means that, in one sense, the natural continuation The temporal continuation of rule in Denmark is out of joint because it's been broken, dislodged by Claudius's murder of the rightful king. But time is also out of joint in another sense. It's doing strange things in Act 1. Remember that in the very first scene, we heard bells tolling midnight, but by the end of that unbroken scene, we're told that dawn is rising. How did several hours pass so quickly? Time really is out of joint in Denmark because nothing is clear or certain, and nothing follows the natural laws anymore. Okay. Now, Hamlet is a play that then is filled with distrust, and we know that distrust breeds spying from the beginning to the very end of this play. We begin Act 2 with Polonius dispatching his servant Rinaldo to go to Paris and spy on his son Laertes by telling him, pretend that you know him slightly and mention him to some of my son's friends. Mention the boys drinking and gambling to those associates so as to elicit from them news about Laertes' possibly more serious indiscretions, like going to brothels, for example. The sneaky Polonius says, your bait of falsehood will take the carp of truth, and thus we do of wisdom and of reach. By indirections, find directions out. Now, this desire to acquire surreptitious information about his son's conduct, this invasive spying on Polonius's part here, is a kind of parody of Hamlet's more serious attempts to get at far more important truths by spying, by watching. He wants to get at fundamental truths that remain uncertain. The truth of whether the ghost he met was really his father. The truth about his father's death. The truth about Claudius's role in it. All of that requires investigation. All of that requires spying on Hamlet's part, even as Hamlet himself is subjected to so much spying. Now, we know from the beginning that Hamlet and Claudius don't trust each other. And Polonius doesn't even trust his own son. No one trusts anyone in this play except Ophelia, who, to her victimhood, trusts everyone. When Ophelia enters, she is distraught and confused at what she takes to be symptoms of Hamlet's madness, unaware, of course, that this is a performance on his part. But the remarkable thing about Ophelia's description of Hamlet's behavior is that Hamlet seems to be disclosing true feelings he has for her within the context of his mad act. Ophelia has been, at this point, forbidden to see him by Polonius. And so Hamlet, in order to see her, has to burst into her private room. And here is how she describes it. My lord, I was sewing in my closet, Lord Hamlet, with his doublet all unbraced, no hat upon his head, his stockings fouled, ungartered, and down guard to his ankle, pale as his shirt, his knees knocking each other, and his look so piteous in purport, as if he had been loosed out of hell. To speak of horrors, he comes before me, and what did he say? Oh, he said nothing, but rather he took me by the wrist and held me hard. Then goes he to the length of all his arm, and with his other hand thus o'er his brow he falls to such perusal of my face as would draw it. Long stayed he so. At last a little shaking of mine arm, and thrice his head thus waving up and down, he raised a sigh so piteous and profound as it did seem to shatter all his bulk and end his being. Thus done, he lets me go, and with his head o'er his shoulder turned, he seemed to find his way out without eyes. For out of doors he went without their help, and to the last bended their light, the light of his eyes, on me. Now, note that we've seen Hamlet complain that other people lie, that they dissemble, that they hide their true feelings behind play acting. But the paradox here is that Shakespeare reveals, and it's true elsewhere too, that sometimes play acting, rather than merely hiding the truth, can disclose certain truths on the part of the performer, even as he is enacting a role. And as we'll see, Sometimes acting a part can also lead to the revelation of those who see that part being played, as Hamlet hopes Claudius and Gertrude's reaction to his feigned madness will reveal their guilt. Now, here, Hamlet's exaggerated gestures before Ophelia, sighing, holding her at arm's length, and gazing at her constantly, even as he walks out the door, those gestures have a double purpose. They seem to be a painful act of farewell that Hamlet really feels for a young woman that he loved, but who has now been forced to reject his letters at her father's command. So one might say Hamlet in this performance expresses genuine feelings of a lover's regret. But at the same time, he makes these actions so strange and so extreme as to appear deranged, as he wants to appear. And he does this because he knows that the distraught Ophelia, seeing this, will report his behavior to her father, who will in turn report it to Claudius, all of which happens. Now, Hamlet would like Claudius and Gertrude to attribute his antic disposition to disappointed love, sort of cut and dry, so that Claudius then won't suspect that Hamlet's mad behavior has anything to do with his dead father. He wants to try to put Claudius's mind at ease so that he can examine him more clearly, and also if he has to strike him when he's not suspecting it. If Hamlet is using Ophelia here for his own protection, it's troubling, and to a large degree I think it's true. But he is also probably, in some way, treating Ophelia this way as a way of protecting her, of alienating her from him at a time when he knows that what he may well have to do is very dangerous and doesn't want her in any way emotionally attached to a man who may have to kill the reigning king. Here and later, as we'll see, when he insults Ophelia, he's trying to end her love for him, for her own sake, even as he is also in this scene pretty much making it clear, even as he bids farewell to her, that he has loved her. Now, as we'll see, Ophelia is going to be so grief-stricken at Hamlet's apparent insanity and at his rejection of her that she becomes genuinely insane and takes her own life, while Hamlet, by contrast, only contemplates suicide and only appears insane. And yet there are moments, critics have argued, when the burden of Hamlet's grief and his morbid isolation may, in fact, drive him to the brink of real madness, even as he is playing a role. There may be moments when there is a thin line between the two. Well, Polonius is completely taken in by Hamlet's performance, as reported, and in an attempt to reveal the truth of what he takes to be the source of Hamlet's malady, Polonius offers Claudius a typically simplistic explanation of the cause of Hamlet's antic disposition. He does so after wasting time, as usual, with tedious and self-indulgent language in this prelude. Although Polonius says brevity is the soul of wit, this comical windbag shows neither brevity nor wit very often, before he finally, in this case, offers his, quote, short tale of what he believes he's concluded about the cause of Hamlet's insanity. He fell into a sadness, then into a fast, thence to a watch, thence to a weakness, thence to a lightness, and by this declension into the madness wherein now he raves. We all mourn for it. Okay. Now, as proof of this theory, Polonius brings, as evidence, a forlorn letter that Hamlet sent to Ophelia, which seems to prove Hamlet's insanity is bound up with her rejection of him as a lover. In this letter, Hamlet says to Ophelia, "Doubt truth be a liar, but never doubt I love." Now, ironically, Hamlet is speaking from his heart here. He advises Ophelia to suspect everything else in the world, skeptic as he is, except his love, which is the one truth that Hamlet knows. Now, there are also truths couched in Hamlet's insulting remarks to Polonius as a foolish old man. And even Polonius realizes that there is some truth being disclosed in Hamlet under the guise of madness, because Polonius, in their encounter, makes this observation when Hamlet speaks of him as looking like a satirical rogue, an old man with gray beards and wrinkled faces and eyes purging thick amber. He says, "For you yourself, sir, you should be old as I am, if like a crab you could go backward." Now it sounds crazy, but even Polonius says in an aside, "Though this be madness, yet there be method in it." Essentially, yes, you're an old man. If you could move backward like a crab walks backward in time, then you'd be a young man. If this be madness, yet there is method in it. How pregnant sometimes his replies are. Indeed, there is truth, sometimes couched, the truth of love or the truth of insults, in what seems to be a mad behavior. Now, note that at this point, Hamlet longs to give up his life. He longs to die. He longs to erase his very being, to escape everything that being carries with it. Mental isolation, uncertainty about what is real and what isn't real, grief over his father's death, and the burden of needing to avenge the father that the ghost laid on him. Well, Claudius has seen evidence of Hamlet's feigned insanity, and he himself is suspicious as to its origin. He doubts that it may be real. He would, of course, like to believe Polonius's claim that Hamlet is suffering from the madness of a love-lorn man. But there are indications that it might be more than this. Remember, Hamlet says when he leaves Polonius, "You cannot take from me anything I will more willingly part withal, except my life, except my life." An individual who, feigning madness, nonetheless says he wishes to die, seems perhaps to be tormented by more than merely an unhappy outcome to his love. Now, as a result then, Claudius in particular wants proof. And when he suggests his concern to Gertrude, he says that Polonius tells me, my dear Gertrude, that he hath found the head and source of all your son's distemper. To which Gertrude says, I doubt it not. I doubt it is no other but the main, his father's death and our unhasty marriage. Gertrude, too, thinks it's more likely that Hamlet's insanity has something to do with what is a source of guilt for her and Claudius, the death of her husband and what she calls our hasty marriage. She's guilty not just about the death of her husband and her involvement in it, but the fact that she married so incriminatingly soon thereafter. Okay, now, unconvinced by Polonius's theory, Claudius summons Hamlet's old friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to serve as spies for him. And he tells them, go and talk to Hamlet, your old friend, sound him out, and report back to me what he says. Well, Claudius presents this as a request, okay? But Rosencrantz and Guildenstern know that it's really a command made in a discreet and civil way. And we should remember that because Claudius's style of leadership is impressive in its subtlety, one might say. We soon learned, for example, that Claudius has successfully avoided an armed conflict with young Fortinbras by sending diplomats to the King of Norway, who then reins in his nephew, young Fortinbras, just as Claudius had hoped. He's an effective leader. Hamlet underestimates Claudius because he hates him so much. But Claudius, on the other hand, as we'll see, does not underestimate Hamlet. Well, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are obviously betraying Hamlet by spying on their old friend for the king. But Hamlet, when they meet, is so isolated and so desperate to unburden himself directly and openly to someone that he discards with them his antic disposition that he wears for everyone else, this pretense of madness, when he meets them. He tells them how wretchedly he feels. Now, he doesn't mention his encounter, of course, with his father's ghost, but he does, however, tell them of his terrible loneliness, of his sense of entrapment, both physical and psychological. He puts it this way. He says, What have you, my good lords, deserved at the hands of fortune that she sends you to a prison hither? Because Denmark is a prison. And when they ask, how is that so? Hamlet says, a goodly prison, in which there are many confines, wards, and dungeons, Denmark being one of the worst. When Rosencrantz asks, we think not, my lord, Hamlet then replies, why then 'tis none to you, for there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. To me, it is a prison. And he then goes on to say, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. Now, Hamlet is advancing, I think, two important ideas in this exchange. First, the mind of each individual is unique. It is so unlike any other mind that we are each imprisoned and hermetically isolated in our own subjective view of the world. And Hamlet feels this subjective isolation acutely, even as he's trying now to connect with his two old friends. Denmark is a prison for Hamlet, less because Claudius has forbidden him to leave than because of Hamlet's psychological entrapment within the globe of his own skull. Denmark is a prison for me because I am in this state, psychologically. The second important idea that he establishes here is that because we each see reality through our own unique subjective perspective, what is, quote, either good nor bad is entirely a product of our thinking, of our psychological perspective, of our subjectivity. In short, the truth of anything is relative to the mind of the observer. It is impossible for any individual mind to know objective truth. Well, Hamlet then is entrapped in the private world of subjective thought that makes it impossible for him to affirm objective reality, to affirm any actual transpersonal truth in anything. And this epistemological prison of consciousness, then, is not just something he carries with him when he is awake, but as he says, he carries it with him also, this prison of consciousness, when he falls asleep. Because his dreams, he says, his bad dreams, are merely a continuation of the mental prison he feels when he is awake. Thus, his reference to, I have bad dreams. Hamlet then goes on to say that a dream is but a shadow. That is to say, a dream is a shadow of our waking conscious life. But if we're unable to affirm when we're awake that anything is real or true or objective, then one might say that our consciousness itself is a shadow, and that our dreams are merely shadows of shadows. Still, despite what he describes here clearly as the troubling limits of subjectivity, the prison of his own consciousness, still, Hamlet strives to know truth, as impossible as that might seem. And one immediate truth that he wants to discover in this encounter with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern is whether he can trust them or not. When he asks if they were sent by Claudius, they hedge at first, and then when he asks them again, they reluctantly admit, yes, we were sent for, but they don't explain why they were sent for. But even then, Hamlet says to himself, okay, you say you were sent for, but then in an aside he says, I'll keep an eye on you. That is to say, I'll watch you as I know you are being forced to watch me. And yet, even in this moment of skepticism, Hamlet is still with these friends so desperate to unburden his inner pain that he tells them now, and speaks more openly about it than ever before, about the depression which we've seen has been causing him to want to commit suicide. He says, and Shakespeare presents this not in blank verse but in prose, I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom or exercises, and indeed it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air, look you, the brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire, why it appeareth nothing to me but a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action how like an angel, in apprehension how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, and yet to me, what is this but a quintessence of dust. Man delights me not, nor woman either. What is man to me but a quintessence of dust? Now, note, although Shakespeare writes these lines in prose rather than blank verse, as I said, they're extraordinary. Hamlet admits that the beauties that his eye sees in the visible world mean nothing to him. They're beautiful, but they have no value for me, nor do other human beings, no matter how gloriously they may have been created. It's one of the most compelling descriptions of serious depression, I think, ever written. Everything Hamlet sees in the world and in other people is reduced to dust, reduced to shit, whether it be the firmament or the beauty of a human face. He can find no comfort or value in creation. Man is merely a quintessence of dust, an essence of nothing. Life, in short, is meaningless, and this is driving him to want to escape life. Well, the profound metaphysical question that Hamlet is asking here, then, is whether there is any purpose in human life, including his own, or whether it is all just an absurdity. Because if it is absurd, then there is absolutely no point, it would seem, in going on living. Now, at this point, note that Hamlet can find no reason or purpose for staying alive. And note that the prospect of revenge that the ghost has laid on him has not given him any direction or purpose or any sense of justice in his view of existence. No, that charge has only increased Hamlet's tendency to question everything in the world and in himself and want to get the hell out of the world and out of himself. Well, this need that I've described on Hamlet's part to unburden himself to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern is so great that even though he is beginning to distrust them, he goes so far as to hint that the madness that others have noted in him isn't real. He says it obliquely when he says, I am mad, but I am mad north by northwest. Now, he's referring here to the true direction of a compass, which points north, okay? And his feigned madness, north by northwest, then, isn't so very far from the truth. And as we've sometimes seen, Hamlet allows himself to express his true feelings under the guise of madness. He assures Rosencrantz and Guildenstern that although he may act mad, though he's certainly not acting mad for them, he's holding that off, that he may be acting mad before others. He says, I know the difference between a hawk and a handsaw. Okay, two different tools. Yes, in short, I'm not really as crazy as people think. Now, you remember that even Polonius had recognized that there's some sort of method in his madness. There's lucidity in what appears crazy. And it's true. Now, at this point, the players arrive, the actors. And Hamlet is pleased because he had been a theater patron in the past, and he now needs distraction, seriously. But he has an idea that just as his own performance is intended to elicit truth by seeing the reactions of Gertrude and Claudius to his feigned madness, so too, Hamlet realizes, he might use the performances of the player to elicit responses from them that he can read, what he later calls the mousetrap. Specifically, he decides that he will have the players perform a version of the killing of a king, and will insert into this script some lines of his own so that when it is played out, he can then watch Claudius and Gertrude's responses to this scene so similar to what they plotted, and he can then, in seeing those responses, confirm, he hopes, on that basis, their guilt. Thus, he says in an aside to the player, Dost thou hear me, old friend? Can you play the murder of Gonzago? Aye, my lord. Well, at it tomorrow night, then. Could you, for a need, study a speech of some 12 or 16 lines, which I would set down and insert? Could you? Well, of course, those lines are going to make even more pointed the similarity between what's being staged and what Claudius did. Now, before we consider Hamlet's second soliloquy that follows from this, I want to note two features of the arrival of the theater troupe of tragedians here, who Hamlet insists, because he likes actors, must be treated with, quote, honor and dignity. The first thing to note about this is that Shakespeare is using this as an opportunity to comment on the theatrical world of London in his own time in a self-reflexive way that his Elizabethan audience would have understood. The actors, we learned, have been forced to earn a living roving around Denmark because the theaters in the capital are now dominated by child performers who are becoming extremely popular. The same was true in Shakespeare's London around 1602 when Hamlet was written. And an actor tells Hamlet that the children are, quote, tyrannically clapped for and now in fashion. Shakespeare seems disgusted by this phenomenon, and he seems to be commenting here on the vagaries of public taste. But the more interesting question that arises with the arrival of these actors is why Hamlet asks them to recite first a particular speech from a play that he recalls, a speech that describes the account of how the Greek warrior Pyrrhus crept out of the Trojan horse at night and, in the sack of Troy, slaughtered the Trojan king Priam and his wife Hecuba. Hamlet particularly wants this recitation at this point. And note that the player who presents it describes it in very gory, bloody detail. But if the gods themselves did see Hecuba then, when she saw Pyrrhus make malicious sport in mincing with his sword her husband's limbs, the instant of clamor burst, and she made, unless things mortal move them not at all, would have made mulch the burning eyes of heaven, the passion of the gods. Now, note something here. What is it about this highly emotional and bloody speech that the player performs at Hamlet's request that so appeals to Hamlet at this moment that he has requested it? Well, I think it's two things, okay? First, the actor who's reciting these lines weeps as he describes the killing of Priam and Hecuba in a full release emotional display. This is welcome to Hamlet because Hamlet complains that he has had to repress his rage and his sorrow and his grief because he knows he's constantly under surveillance. He's constantly being watched. He feels bottled up, as we've seen from the beginning. The second reason the speech appeals to him, though, is it describes a violent action at a time when Hamlet feels paralyzed because he's torn between the demands of his father's ghost that he avenge his death and his growing doubts about the reality of this supernatural figure. But at the same time, remember, this speech is troubling because it depicts the horrible murder of old Priam, who is the legitimate king of Troy, by a bloodthirsty brute, rather than depicting the killing of an illegitimate king, which is what the ghost has told Hamlet he must do. The man who sits on the throne is a serpent. He is not the real king. You must kill him. So, left alone, when the actors depart, Hamlet delivers his second great soliloquy. It's the longest soliloquy in the play, and I think possibly the most complex, as we find Hamlet pitting thought against thought in this meditation. Let's have a look at it now, and note that it falls into three parts as his ideas pivot. Let's consider the first section. Now I am alone. Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I! Is it not monstrous that this player here, but in a fiction, in a dream of passion, could force his soul so to his own conceit, that from her working all his visage wane, tears in his eyes, distraction in his aspect, a broken voice, and his whole function suiting with forms to his conceit, and all for nothing, for Hecuba? What's Hecuba to him, or he to Hecuba, that he should weep for her? What would he do had he the motive and the cue for passion that I have? He would drown the stage in tears and cleave the general ear with horrid speech, make mad the guilty and appall the free, confound the ignorant and amaze indeed the very faculties of eyes and ears. Yet I, a dull and muddy-mettled rascal, peak like John's a dream, unpregnant of my cause, and can say nothing. No, not for a king upon whose property the most dear life, a damned defeat was made. All right, let's consider. Hamlet begins, I am alone. He's now alone on stage, but he has always been alone psychologically in this play, trapped within himself, as he had said. And nothing makes clearer his isolation more than the fact that he is now talking to himself. Well, Having watched the actor weep as he described the killing of Priam and the grief of Hecuba, Hamlet castigates himself for suppressing the depth of his own sorrow and rage at his father's murder. It's partly that he feels he must suppress these powerful feelings for his own protection as he's being watched, but it's also, we've noted, that he believes that there is no outward show of his inner feelings that could express the depth of his inner agony. In the short line, "Yet I," Hamlet then compares himself to the actor on stage and condemns his own silence, his own failure to act on the ghost's command. Not only has he not shown his grief, he has not acted as his father had told him to, vengefully. He has been, in his word, unpregnant or non-productive thus far in fulfilling the violent cause that his father assigned to him. Now, the second phase of the soliloquy begins with Hamlet's reflection on why it is that he hasn't yet acted, why he has neither accused Claudius of murder verbally nor attacked him physically. Is it cowardice in myself, Hamlet asks, or is it something else? This begins, "Am I a coward who calls me a villain, breaks my pate across, plucks off my beard and blows in my face, tweaks me by the nose, gives me the lie in the throat and deep in the lungs? Who does this, me? Ha, swounds, I should take it, for I cannot be but a pigeon-livered and lack gall to make oppression bitter. Or ere this, I should have fatted all the region's kites with this slave's awful. Bloody, bawdy villain, remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless, lane. Oh, vengeance! Why, what an ass I am! This is most brave, that I, the son of a dear father murdered, prompted to my revenge by heaven and hell, must like a whore unpack my heart with words and fall a-cursing like a very drab, a scallion, oh, fie upon it, about my brains." Now, note here that Hamlet is accusing himself, in trying to understand why he has not acted, of being pigeon-livered, lily-livered, as it were, of being unmanly. Why else, he says, haven't I, quote, fatted the region's kites with the body of Claudius? That is, why haven't I killed Claudius and left his dead bodies for the vultures, the kites, to grow fat on devouring? Hamlet hates himself for his inaction, and so he tries to work himself up in this part of the soliloquy to vengeful violence by imagining various insults that ought to enrage him, that ought to drive him to any form of retaliation, someone pulling on his beard or tweaking his nose. But the crime that Claudius has committed against him, of course, is far greater, and so it ought to impel him even more as an insult to kill him. Thus, he says, Claudius is a bloody, bawdy villain. He's treacherous in killing the king by stealth, and he's lecherous in seducing the oversexed Gertrude. He ought to die. What's wrong with me? Well, Hamlet reminds himself that he is being prompted to kill Claudius, prompted to my revenge by both heaven and hell. That is, he tells himself, taking Claudius's life would be just in the eyes of God, because Claudius is a murderer, and yet it would be a murder that might also delight and be sanctioned by the devil. Again, why am I not acting then, if in fact there is this higher sanction for it? Thus he cries, "Oh, vengeance!" in an attempt to spur himself on to act, hurling abuse on himself, trying to drive himself to killing. Yet Hamlet has not acted, and he is trying to understand here what is holding him back. Is it simply cowardice? He derives himself as an ass for not following the ghost's demands and the promptings of his own aggrieved heart to kill Claudius. Instead, he says he is merely continuing to question himself in these turbulent inner meditations, as he puts it, unpacking my heart with words in these soliloquies, in these mental exercises, rather than enacting the violent deeds that are necessary. Well, looking at himself this way, condemning himself for his failure to act to this point, and relying only on thought, Hamlet, at the end of this section of the soliloquy, compares himself, in his own eyes, to one who is no better than a prostitute or a kitchen servant. Now, as we'll see, there are indeed good reasons for Hamlet's delay. He is not a coward, as he accuses himself of being. He is, I think we realize, much harder on himself here in blaming himself for not acting than the audience is. But at this point, the soliloquy turns again, and we enter now its third phase. We see this turn when Hamlet says to himself, as if a different idea has just entered his mind, and it has. It's the returning idea that he had devised earlier when he asked the actor to perform the murder of Gonzago so that he could watch Claudius and try to confirm his suspicions. I have heard that guilty creatures sitting at a play have, by the very cunning of the scene, been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malfections. For murder, though it have no tongue, will speak with most miraculous organ. I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father before my uncle's eyes. I'll observe his looks. I'll tent him to the quick. If it do blench, I know my course, that is, if he turns pale. The spirit that I have seen may be a devil, and the devil have power to assume pleasing shape. Yea, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits, abuses me to damn thee. I'll have grounds more relative than this. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king, ending in a couplet. Now, note that Hamlet, who is under surveillance here, wants to put Claudius under his own surveillance. He wants to watch the king's body language, his facial expressions. Will he turn pale? Will he rush out? In short, he wants to stage a version of the murder that Claudius committed 2 months earlier and, quote, observe his looks. Hamlet tells himself that he must do so because although he cannot trust what Claudius says, by surprising him this way, he hopes that the play will catch Claudius off guard and that he won't be able to maintain his performative show of regal innocence and pretend grief as he has before. In short, that he'll reveal and betray an authentic guilt taken by surprise this way. Well, just as Hamlet has been trying to confirm the truth of Claudius's guilt as a murderer by playing the part of a madman, he hopes now that by forcing Claudius to watch this enactment of a murder, he will also cause Claudius to reveal something that he can believe in as true and real. Thus, the play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of a king, wherein he will reveal in his gestures and behavior the depth of his own guilt. But the problem is that Hamlet still can't trust what his eyes see. As he's made clear earlier, reality is subjective, and the visible world can be deceiving, both because others deceive us and because it's filtered through our own unique perspective. And this uncertainty is, in fact, the very reason that Hamlet hasn't yet acted on the ghost's command, because he can't be sure of what he saw when he talked to that ghost. He can't be sure the specter was, for sure, his father. It might, he realizes, have been some devil tempting him to commit a murder by impersonating the dead king. If this was a diabolical trick and Hamlet were to fall for it by killing Claudius, he would then kill an innocent man and he would go to hell. And he feels perhaps that the devil might be playing upon him because he knows that Hamlet is so distraught and melancholic that he would be all the more vulnerable. Well, given Hamlet's skeptical understanding of how elusive truth is, of how the eye and the ear so often deceive us, Hamlet then has a compelling moral reason to seek greater certainty about Claudius's guilt before trying to slay him. As Hamlet tells Horatio earlier, there are things in heaven and earth beyond the reach of your philosophy, but Hamlet doesn't claim to understand what those things are. So despite his self-castigation, he's not making excuses to justify his inaction. He has a sound moral and epistemological basis to hesitate. Now, Hamlet rightly suspects that if Claudius is guilty of murder, He will be tormented by his conscience so that he won't be able to hide it. And Hamlet is right. Claudius has heretofore tried to hide his gnawing remorse behind this performance of regal authority and feigned grief for his dead brother. But Claudius reveals his guilt in his private thoughts before he reveals it during the mousetrap. We see this at the start of Act 3, when Polonius tells Claudius that, quote, pious acts often sugar over the devil himself. And in response to that remark, Claudius says, oh, and an aside, a little mini soliloquy, oh, 'tis true, how smart a lash that speech doth give my conscience. The harlot's cheek, beautied with plastering art, is not more ugly to the thing that helps it than is my deed to my most painted word. Oh, heavy burden. Well, note here that Claudius reveals then a kind of inner complexity that in some ways helps to establish him as a worthy antagonist to Hamlet. He speaks of his guilt not just for the murder, which he refers to in this passage as the thing that he has done, the ugly thing, but he also refers to his guilt for his painted words, for his cover-up. Both the murder and the lies that follow prey upon him. Now, at this point, Claudius and Polonius are staging their own act of surveillance in an attempt to confirm truth, as Hamlet is planning. Specifically, Claudius wants proof that Hamlet's mad behavior has indeed been caused by Ophelia's forced withdrawal from him. If he could prove that, it would be a relief, but as we've seen, he already has some serious doubts about this, whereas Polonius has none. So Claudius and Polonius, in order to confirm this, plan to eavesdrop on Ophelia's conversation with Hamlet when Hamlet comes in. And of this, Claudius says that her father, Polonius, and myself, lawful espials, will so bestow ourselves that, seeing unseen, we may of their encounter frankly judge, and gather by him as he is behaved, if the affliction of his love, or know that thus he suffers from. Okay? Thus the parallelism of Hamlet's surveillance of Claudius and Claudius' surveillance of Hamlet. But note that in this explanation of how he and Polonius will eavesdrop on Hamlet's conversation with Ophelia from behind the arras, from behind this curtain or tapestry, Claudius calls this espionage lawful. But in what sense is this lawful? Well, it's lawful because he's the king and he makes the law, but it is also lawful, he claims, because they're spying on Hamlet to try to get to the root of his madness and thus help him be cured of it. Now, Polonius gives Ophelia a religious book of devotions to read so that when Hamlet comes in and sees her, she will somehow be displaying before his eyes her natural virginal purity. But Ophelia, while she takes this book, doesn't know that her father and Claudius are going to be listening in on the conversation. Here, as elsewhere, Ophelia is a victim of the plans and the needs of others, including Hamlet. When Hamlet enters, before speaking to Ophelia, he delivers the most famous soliloquy ever written, to be or not to be. Should I continue to be, continue to exist, or should I kill myself? Not be. Now, as we saw in his first soliloquy, Hamlet's depression, born of his grief and isolation, is so deep that he wished even then that his flesh would dissolve into a dew, that he would simply leave life into an eternal blackness. And that was before his troubling encounter with the ghost. That terrible obligation to revenge his dead father that he received has only deepened Hamlet's urge to escape entirely because his failure to act on it has filled him with self-hatred. But what's the problem? What would death be like? As he says, there's the rub. Well, as in the previous soliloquy, in this one, Hamlet poses idea against idea as the meditation evolves. And I hope you will all read this aloud to yourselves. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffed off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurs that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fartles bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of? Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment, with this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Now, Hamlet asks, is it nobler for a man to suffer the slings and arrows of his existence, in Hamlet's case, the loss of his father, his mother's hasty marriage, the burden that he faces of avenging him, or is it nobler to end the heartache and the mental suffering that he feels and all of what he calls the pains that flesh is heir to, in short, escape the pain of what it means to be human and the pain of what it means specifically to be himself by stabbing himself to death with a dagger, a bare bodkin? Well, that's the existential question, to live or to die, the dilemma of being that Hamlet faces at this acute moment. Why doesn't he just take his own life, he asks himself. Well, earlier the reason was that he cited a theological one, that self-slaughter is an unforgivable sin that damns your soul, according to the church, because, of course, in the act of sinning, you end your life and have no recourse to atonement. But what Hamlet now presents as the grounds for his hesitation are different from that. And they begin with the analogy between death and sleep. We often think of death as analogous to our sleep, in which our body is in repose, we don't move, and we're no longer consciously alert. What Hamlet wants in death, however, is not something equivalent to sleep. That's the problem. What he wants is total oblivion, a blackout, an eradication of consciousness, an eradication of his swirling, turbulent thoughts that produce the soliloquies, an eradication of the painful memories that have haunted his waking life and his dreams. But if death then is like a sleep, then as with sleep, we have dreams which visit us during our sleep. And by the same token, then, it would appear that if death is like sleep, and sleep is a continuation of our consciousness when we're awake, death may be a continuation of our consciousness after our body has ceased to be alive. In short, it may be continuation of consciousness in some terrible new way. This is not a fear of hell for sinning. This is simply a fear that the mind goes on, when in fact what Hamlet wants is to snuff out the mind. That's what Hamlet calls the rub. The impediment to suicide is his fear of the extension of consciousness. This fear that, quote, dreams may come after the death of our bodies. Those mortal coils that enclose our souls, even when we kill those off with a dagger, dreams, consciousness, as it were, may continue. Now, Hamlet assumes that other men have been held back from suicide by this same consideration, this same fear that consciousness in some form goes on, possibly more terrible than we know it in life. Why else, he reasons, would human beings in such great numbers endure the pangs of all the things he cites? Failed loves, the insolence of tyrants, the insults of proud men that make life so miserable. Why would we put up with these things if we weren't afraid that somehow death is not the end? The possibility that the ills of extended consciousness after death may be worse than those we endure in life is what makes Hamlet pause here. That's the rub. He can no more then act to kill himself at this moment than he can act to kill Claudius, because there is simply too much moral and metaphysical uncertainty in both acts. Thus, Hamlet's resolutions to violent action against Claudius and himself are both held back, he says, by the pale cast of thought, which makes cowards of us all and makes us, quote, lose the name of action and simply instead speculate. Now, while Hamlet is still tormenting himself for his inaction here, at least now he understands that he's not alone in thinking the way he does about suicide. At the end of the soliloquy, he sees Ophelia and begins one of the most painful exchanges in the play. Why does he insult her here, suggesting that she is oversexed and repeatedly telling her because of that, get thee to a nunnery, that is, go to a convent before you get pregnant, girl? Well, knowing that Ophelia loves him, why does Hamlet torment her, first by saying, I loved you once, and then even worse by saying, no, I love thee not at all? Well, Ophelia takes this cruel behavior as a symptom of Hamlet's derangement, and she is grief-stricken. Help him, sweet heaven, she says, and oh, what a noble mind is here o'erthrown. She's agonized at the Hamlet that she sees. He was the glass of fashion, the mold of form, to observe of all observers quite down. Oh, to see him that way, quite down, and I of ladies most deject and wretched, that sucked the honey of his music vows. Oh, woe is me, to have seen what I have seen, to see what I now see. It's terrible. Now, the trauma of seeing Hamlet, this man that she loved and so admired, and who she thought loved her, now in a state of brutal derangement, is so crushing that the shock of it drives Ophelia into a real madness, ending in a real suicide, things that Hamlet only plays at or contemplates. Why is he doing this? Well, I think it is not just to convince Ophelia and those that he knows Ophelia will report his behavior back to, that he is in fact insane and that she is the cause of it. That is indeed one reason. But Hamlet also, I think, in behaving this way, is acting generously. He wants to save Ophelia from her love for him at a time when he has been charged with killing the king of Denmark, when he knows he is mentally unstable to the extent that he is longing for suicide. In short, he wants to protect Ophelia from being caught up in his own terrible destiny. And so he tries here to drive her away with his insults, while at the same time warning her about the danger of loving him. As, for example, when he says, I am very proud, revengeful, ambitious, with mere offenses at my beck than I have thought, more offenses at my beck than I have thoughts to put them in, imagination to give them shape, or time to act them out. Vengeful, ambitious, proud, I'm all of these things. You want to have nothing to do with me. Now, of course, he exaggerates, but he is trying to free her from her attachment to him, in part for her own sake. Paradoxically, Hamlet then injures Ophelia this way precisely because he loves her. And he doesn't see what the scene is going to do to her. Hamlet doesn't understand what this behavior, partly in order to protect her from himself, will lead her to, any more than he knows at this moment that he is being heard by Claudius and Polonius behind the arras. Well, far from convincing Claudius that Hamlet's mental malady has been caused by love, overhearing this scene causes Claudius to become more suspicious, causes him to sense that the real cause of Hamlet's derangement is something else, something that is potentially dangerous to him. And as the scene ends then, Claudius plans to send Hamlet off to England on the pretext of a state mission to another country. Now, why would he do this after earlier having denied Hamlet's desire to go off to Wittenberg? Then he had wanted to keep an eye on Hamlet in the castle. But now Claudius wants to get Hamlet out of Denmark because he senses that whatever is causing this behavior, whether it's feigned or real, is something that must have something to do with me. And thus, He wants to get him out of Denmark because he feels that Hamlet is dangerous to him. But at the same time, he's going to continue to watch Hamlet abroad by sending him across the seas with spies. And if necessary, it becomes fairly clear, I think, that even now Claudius knows that if necessary, he will have those spies assassinate Hamlet. Okay.